ذاك الدرب قولي أهوى درب الأقصى قولي أهوى ذاك الدرب بان البعد طال العهد.
Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
It's 3:02. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. You are tuned into Salam Media with me, Humairaa Mayet, until 3:30. Do remember that this segment is streaming live on our website, salammedia.com/listen-live, and on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Salam Media. Remember to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe on YouTube. All comments and questions can be WhatsApped to 061 766 0555. On 13th August 2020, in an unprecedented turn of events, President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed declared a full normalization of ties between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. This declaration sent shockwaves across both the Arab world and the Muslim world, as, prior to this, Arab states had appeared to be in open disregard of the State of Israel. Termed to be a historic diplomatic breakthrough, the normalization of relations between these two states in their entirety will undoubtedly have ripple effects, both in the region of the Middle East and around the world. The statement released by the United States, Israel, and the UAE following the meeting of the leaders of these countries claimed that this deal will mutually benefit all three states and allow for diplomatic ties to be established. Both Israel and the UAE have stated that these diplomatic ties were established in order to create links between two of the most dynamic societies in the Middle East and in an attempt to advance both the Israeli and the Emirati economies. Relations to be established between the two countries include those of many natures, including investment, tourism, security, healthcare, culture, technology, and many others. Moreover, each country plans on establishing an embassy in the other, conducting direct flights between the two states, and even working together toward the development of a vaccine for the coronavirus. Israel and the UAE, which America calls its most reliable and capable regional partners, will most certainly secure many financial and other gains after brokering this deal. The many negative implications of this deal, however, seem to have fallen by the wayside and are overshadowed by claims of cooperation and diplomacy, which even extend to worshippers. The statement claimed that holy sites in Jerusalem and other areas will be fully operational and will gladly welcome residents of the UAE. Indeed, this is an incredibly complex and convoluted deal, which will alter the fabric of the Middle East for years to come. Today, I am joined by Hafiz Ibrahim Musa, freelance journalist and researcher at the Palestine Information Network. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us today.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks a million, Humairaa.
So normalization is a loaded term, and I'm sure you would agree. Could you begin by explaining to us exactly what normalization entails and offering a brief history of the normalization of the State of Israel?
Excellent. I think that is a very important question to start off with, given that use this term so often in the context of the UAE normalization, and we are expecting, unfortunately, that many other countries or a number of other countries perhaps might take this route because of financial incentives or whatever other diplomatic pressure that's exerted on them. So basically, normalization, if we were to define it, is when one conducts relations with a party or with a state on the guise that everything is normal, that this is a country that is acceptable to do relations with. This country is not guilty of any human rights violations of a major scale, and therefore, you can continue doing business with them as normal. And it also has this element of subjugation within it, to say that even if this state is a superior state and the state is an oppressive state that you are conducting business with, the fact you come to a kind of resignation that there's no way to exact or extract justice from the state, and therefore the only way to continue is to accept the status quo as is, and accept it as a militarily superior power that can do as it will, and you just continue to liaise with it on a normal basis when it comes to business, when it comes to diplomatic relations, etc. And those people who decide to normalize with an oppressive state, they do two things. They trivialize the oppression, to say it's not so serious, or it doesn't bother us at all, or we don't really care about human rights violations. On the other hand, we kind of accept that these oppressions exist, but what can we do about it? None of our business. We live with it. And the ways of normalization that we can highlight is obviously on the diplomatic level, as we've seen with the UAE and Israel. But there are also normalization initiatives at a grassroots level where through tourism people normalize, through sport people normalize. One accepts the technology and accepts that a country is supposedly a leader in certain types of technology, and do deals in that regard, and just keep a blind eye to all the other parts of their existence and their relationship. And what is dangerous then about normalization is that people feel that if you turn and you engage in dialogue, you have all these airy-fairy type of relationships, it will change. It will change the realities on the ground, but it won't. And that is why people in Palestine and across the world, advocates for justice, are so hell-bent against normalization, because it just gives the occupier, it gives the oppressor greater legitimacy. It feeds a sense of complacency and gives the false and harmful impression of normalcy in what is a totally abnormal situation of colonial oppression. It goes even further than that, because in accepting this relationship, you are equating, in the Palestinian situation, oppressor with oppressed. You are equating occupier with occupied, and I would argue not even equating. You're probably putting the occupier and the oppressor way above the needs and the requirements of the oppressed and occupied. So what has fed normalization for a long time is people say, only through reconciliation, only through dialogue, only through forgiveness will we be able to progress, and we'll be able to find a solution to a conflict. The opposite is that, even if we have to look to South Africa, first came the resistance, first came the boycotts, and only after we saw the main form of oppression ended, that's when the doors of reconciliation, dialogue, and forgiveness were opened. And that's why the position across the Arab world, officially, but even more than that, amongst the people, has been no normalization with Israel. It created itself on a campaign of ethnic cleansing and violating international law. Thereafter, occupying more Palestinian land illegal under international law. So the requirement was, you only can normalize if you end the occupation, if you allow Palestinian refugees to return, and you allow for equal rights of Palestinians within the state. But some countries have veered from that under pressure, and perhaps their circumstances were different from that of the United Arab Emirates. We had Egypt doing it in 1979 and Jordan doing it in 1994. Not justified at all, and obviously made them very unpopular at the time. But compared to the UAE normalization, perhaps people will look at that in a slightly, with some context, and say perhaps we can understand to some extent why did you do that, because you're sharing a border, and you cannot be in a perpetual state of war. So there might have been some considerations that forced these countries to go that route, as controversial as it was, versus the UAE, which doesn't have any compelling reason to even go that route. So far, two countries have done it. Many organizations, perhaps entities around the world have followed that route, but by and large, this has been a rule that has been emphasized throughout the Arab world and held as a constant, that no normalization as long as these abnormal conditions persist.
The establishment of ties between Israel and the UAE was obviously not a sporadic or spur of the moment occurrence. Surely there must have been discussions taking place between the two states prior to this large-scale declaration.
Yes, and that's why people have been saying that this particular deal just didn't come out of the blue, and perhaps we shouldn't be that as much surprised that it's gone down this route. Some have actually dug as deep as as the 1990s to say that that's when relationships started, when leaders in the UAE or Abu Dhabi specifically wanted to purchase certain fighter jets already from that stage from the United States of America. And, one understands that the United States always aspires and actively conspires for Israel to have the military edge in the region. And therefore, the UAE realized that the only way to be able to perhaps get these fighter jets is to get a sympathetic ear from Israel. Already from that stage, some sort of context had been conducted at a stage when this was absolutely taboo, even on the official level in the Arab world. That has only escalated in the past decade, since the Arab Spring, and it was coming out more and more in the open in the last few years. The United Arab Emirates itself being a despotic country with a despotic regime, needing to spy on its own citizens, people who are dissidents, etc. They relied or went out to Israel to use their surveillance technology. Then we had athletics cooperation between the two countries, allowing Israeli athletes to come to Abu Dhabi and Dubai, unfurl the Israeli flag, sing the Israeli national anthem, etc. And the two countries have also kind of found a relationship, or the Israelis and Americans were able to convince them to try and get closer, because they presented to them the threat of Iran, and therefore this is a means of an alliance between people who supposedly have a common enemy, and therefore when one looks at all of this and through apparent research institutes, subtle discussions taking place, what we are seeing now, as I said earlier, is not historic. If something has been going on for almost 3 decades, it's not something that has come out of the blue, but simply the natural conclusion of years of concealed normalization now coming out in the open.
So pan-Arabism and Arab solidarity have always played a large role in the shunning of Israel by Arab states, yet the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE goes against everything that these ideals stand for. And in creating diplomatic links with Israel, the UAE has certainly dealt a blow to the Palestinians. Where exactly do the dispossessed people of Palestine feature in all of this?
That's what probably makes normalization so immoral. Is that they are totally airbrushed from the entire process. I mean, you quoted parts of this deal that was announced in August, and even looking at the text of that deal, it talks about the relationship between a tripartite relationship or alliance between the United Arab Emirates, the United States of America, and Israel. And besides that one mention of annexation there, trying to somehow link it to the plight of the Palestinians, everything else in that particular document purely spoke about the relationships between these two great countries, etc., as if, one can never talk about Israel without talking about the Palestinian territories and the thousands of Palestinians, millions of Palestinians that are under its oppressive sway. So the Palestinians have, very conveniently been sidestepped, and the Israelis, went through this entire process with the Americans since the 80s and 90s. Working with Yasser Arafat, working with the Palestinian Authority after the Oslo Accords, and those who were their partners at that stage obviously have seen through how futile the entire exercise was. And now that they are being more assertive, now that they're speaking out, the Israelis simply took them out of the equation, took the Palestinians totally out of the equation, and just said, let's just ignore this altogether and let's proceed with our plans. This doesn't come from out of the blue. It comes from a position where the Israelis feel emboldened with Donald Trump in the White House, and they feel they can do whatever they like, and therefore this is the opportunity to simply ignore the Palestinians. But it would definitely come back to haunt them, because one cannot have so many Palestinians living on their land, determined to hold on to their rights, just ignored, and hope that problem wishes itself away. Or in addition to the Palestinians in Palestine, you've got all the refugees in the neighboring countries. Those are facts on the ground. Those people are longing to return to home. So airbrushing them from the situation might serve you in the short term, but it just emboldens the determination of the Palestinians to return home. And the positive from all of this is, while previously some groups of Palestinians played along with the Israelis in the so-called peace process, which was an absolute sham, Palestinians today are, although still disunited in a sense politically, when it comes to normalization, are speaking with a more unified voice than ever. Whether it's Hamas, whether it's Fatah, whether it's all the other groupings in Palestine, all have come out talking about this as betrayal, talking about it as rejection, and perhaps this has been a way to develop a long sought after Palestinian unity, which had up till this moment been a kind of elusive pipe dream.
In July, prior to the brokering of the deal between Israel and the UAE, Israel was set to annex portions of the West Bank as per the deal of the century. This annexation, however, has been put on hold following the establishment of diplomatic ties between Israel and UAE. Do you believe that the annexation will be halted indefinitely?
Even if you go to the actual document, the very language used shows that there's no will whatsoever to stop the annexation altogether. I can't recall the exact word that was used, but it speaks of just delaying it or postponing it in a sense. And therefore, I think the very notion, some media reports talk about this as the UAE Israel peace deal, and that for me is taboo language. You cannot talk about this as a peace deal. First of all, these two countries were never at war. If at all, they enjoyed, as we spoke about, very cozy relationships for years. There's no space to bring parties together when they were never apart. But beyond that, the Palestinians are the actual party to the Israeli aggression here. Their voice was not considered in this agreement. And then going on to the issue of annexation, it was merely postponed. And we have to appreciate, again, as you mentioned the timeline there, when the Israelis announced, there was a big media spotlight at the beginning of July that they're going to start the annexation. and thereafter it kind of fell off the radar that this annexation is not going to happen because of disagreements between the Israelis and the Americans. But there's this concept of the de facto annexation versus de jure annexation, whereby the West Bank, occupied West Bank, is effectively annexed already. It just hasn't happened formally in terms of a statute to that effect. So this is merely a tactic by the Israelis to say that we've postponed the annexation, and we're doing this out of goodwill to our Arab neighbors, whereas on the ground, settlements continue to be built, more checkpoints popping up, more confiscation of land, more house demolitions, you name it, the full bouquet of Israeli crimes continue. So just like when we started off with the peace process, there were just a couple of 100,000 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and after that process, starting from the early 90s, come today, there are over 600,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So while the talk of peace was going on, and supposedly, we're still debating about settlements, they were creating facts on the ground. And this is exactly what's going to happen here. We've supposedly postponed annexation. We take people's focus off the ball, and now we're talking about peace between the countries. The focus of the Palestinian solidarity movement kind of splits. We're not talking so much about, can't dedicate so much focus on settlements and occupation. We now focus on normalization and this kind of betrayal. And on the ground, these kind of developments continue unabated. So, if anything, nobody should buy into this premise that this is a peace deal, number one, and in any way hold out any hope. And I've been quite unequivocal about this, that this is going to stop annexation. Annexation will continue, and arguably it is continuing as we speak.
And then lastly, the normalization is not simply a deal for peace, but a multi-layered agreement. As I'd mentioned earlier, Israel and the UAE are set to collaborate in every sector imaginable, it seems. What do you believe to be the major areas of cooperation between these two countries?
This is an interesting question again, because, there are things here, for instance, like visits to Masjid al-Aqsa, annexation, etc., that are made to be the sweeteners of this deal. But beyond this, this is a pure business deal that benefits Israeli and American interests, and it's just cloaked in this language of being historic and being about peace. So the document talks about tourism, it talks about flights, healthcare, energy, innovation, and diplomatic relations, embassies, etc. that we spoke about. We've already seen that taking effect, whereby you've got these flights that took off from Tel Aviv going over to the United Arab Emirates. And even before the deal was signed, I should say, we had Etihad landing a flight in Tel Aviv. So those kind of developments will happen. But in terms of big money, perhaps they're not really located in these kind of relations. The big money turner here is security. And as I mentioned earlier, the United States and Israel have obviously painted for the United Arab Emirates that Iran is the threat in the region. This is the bogeyman, and because of that, there needs to be defense technologies. There need to be security cooperation. When you talk security cooperation, you go to the United States of America, tap on their military industrial complex. And then inevitably, if you're trying to, secure American artillery and American military hardware, you would require, the Israeli technology part of it, Israeli support in that. So those two are tied. So it's a big money turner for the military-industrial complex. And then, I spoke earlier about the spying software, United Arab Emirates being a surveillance state, and there's the NSO in Israel, which specializes in the surveillance technology that's used on phones. Used allegedly the likes of monitoring dissidents in the region like Jamal Khashoggi, etc. And there's a very practical reason here that United Arab Emirates is a very small country with a very, very small population, relatively speaking. So we've got 10 million citizens. The majority of those are not even Emiratis. And despite its weak numerical position, the United Arab Emirates has decided to punch supposedly above its weight. It's got involved in countries like Yemen, it's got involved in countries like Libya, and it's picking fights with people like Turkey, etc., who are a strong, 80 million strong population, 20 million strong population versus the outnumbered Emiratis. And the United Arab Emirates has decided to get involved in all of these conflicts to try and flex its muscles. And this could fall apart at any stage given the odds that are against it. But instead of scaling back from the repression, scaling back from involvement in trying to supposedly subdue the elements of the Muslim Brotherhood in all of these countries, what the United Arab Emirates is doing is entrenching its position. And the only way that it's going to be able to survive in a neighborhood where it is outnumbered numerically, as well as in terms of the populations of all these countries that oppose the kind of meddling, the brand of meddling that it is involved in, what it's done is to ally then with a country that is in a similar position to it, which is Israel, which is obviously pursuing similar policies of repression and is unpopular in the region. So an alliance here between two unpopular countries, and each propping each other up economically as well as diplomatically. And this is the gamble that the United Arab Emirates is taking, to rely on Israeli support for security reasons, so that it can continue suppressing the will, not only of its own population, but as well as the wide spectrum of people in the region.
Let's take a short break, and once we're back, we will continue the conversation with Hafiz Ibrahim Musa, focusing on the effects that this deal will have on Masjid al-Aqsa.
COVID-19 has been declared a global pandemic, and South Africa has called a national lockdown to curb its spread. At this difficult time, the Al Imdad Foundation is assisting informal traders who lose their livelihoods, the homeless, the elderly, and those who are most vulnerable in South Africa and internationally. Let's fight this crisis together. Donate online at alimdad.com or call 0861 786 243 for more information.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness. And every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and free zakat calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
Willowton Group, manufacturers of Sunfoil, Sunshine D, and Delight, supports the Stay Home, Save South Africa campaign and calls for all South Africans to heed the call to help stop the spread of the coronavirus pandemic. Practice social distancing, wash your hands regularly with soap, avoid touching your face, and cough and sneeze into your elbow or into a tissue and throw it away immediately. Together we can beat this. Together we have hope. Visit sacoronavirus.co.za for more information.
Salam Media, a global voice for humanity.
It's 31 minutes past 3. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. You are tuned in to Salam Media with me, Humairaa Mayet. Do remember that this segment is streaming live on our website, salammedia.com/listen-live, and on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Salam Media. Remember to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and subscribe on YouTube. All comments and questions can be WhatsApp to 061 766 0055. We are in conversation with Hafiz Ibrahim Musa, a freelance journalist and researcher at the Palestine Information Network. Now, a certain point of contention within the deal brokered by Israel and the UAE is Masjid al-Aqsa. Following the normalization of ties between Israel and the UAE, protests broke out in the compound of the mosque, calling upon the UAE to reconsider its newly formed diplomatic relationship with Israel. Protesters raised concerns over the deal, which claimed that all Muslims who come in peace may visit and pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Jerusalem's other holy sites should remain open for peaceful worshippers of all faiths. This, however, is not the case. Masjid al-Aqsa, although open to people of all religions in the past, allowed only for Muslims to pray within the four walls of the mosque. Palestinians have stated that the wording of the clause in the deal may very well allow for people of all faiths to pray within Masjid al-Aqsa, indeterminably altering its status quo. Now, Hafiz Ibrahim, what exactly is the status quo of Masjid al-Aqsa at present, and how will it change in relation to the deal made by Israel and the UAE?
This is, requires a bit of explanation here. What the status quo is, first and foremost, is a long-standing understanding, dating back for centuries, particularly made clear during the Ottoman times, and it's even in present times, in the so-called peace process where the Americans were involved, and even the peace treaty that was signed between Jordan and the State of Israel in 1994. All of these spoke of the status quo and the status quo being respected. What the status quo is that Masjid al-Aqsa, and all the other religious sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holy site in Christianity in Jerusalem, and other sites are to be used as places of worship specifically by adherents of that particular faith. And when it came to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for instance, there would be a sharing between the different denominations of Christianity. So, it's always been that Masjid al-Aqsa is purely, even according to international law, a place of Muslim worship, and other people are welcome to visit, but purely coming as visitors and not claiming any sovereignty over the masjid. What this deal has done is, introduce into the sphere of treaties and into the sphere of international relations this idea that Masjid al-Aqsa is no longer exclusively for Muslims, but rather is to be a shared space. And this goes down the route of what we have seen, for instance, in places like Hebron in the West Bank, where Masjid Ibrahim, has now become a divided space after years of serving, exclusively as a masjid. So that's in a nutshell what this deal, the dangers of this particular deal presents by talking about people of all faiths using this as a place of prayer, effectively, opening the door to Masjid Al-Aqsa to the people who want the greatest share in it, which is the Zionist temple movement, and thereby eroding a long-held status quo and risking a very flammable situation in Palestine as well as across the Muslim world.
Trump's deal of the century and his so-called Middle East peace plan have aimed to address the issue of Masjid al-Aqsa and delve into the specifics of the mosque itself. How exactly did it go about doing this?
So there's two, right? The first is one that we're dealing with at the moment is this UAE-Israel deal, but we have to appreciate that happens in the framework of what Donald Trump has been trumpeting as the deal of the century. He's been talking about it for years, and then finally in January of this year, he issued a document called Vision for Peace, where it went into much detail of what this plan entails, the economic benefits, etc. And that was already when this idea of altering the status quo of Masjid al-Aqsa was shaken, where it said that peaceful people, adherents of all faiths, should be allowed to pray in Masjid al-Aqsa, and that marked a significant change. Whereas even Israeli leaders before, to try and appease the international community, always said that we respect the status quo, nothing will change about the status quo. And here, in a very subtle way, or perhaps not very subtle way, it's been brought to the fore, the demands of the temple movement, that people of all faiths should pray. And that is expressly against everything that has been established in international law at this point in time. And therefore, that was already a very big warning sign that if this plan goes ahead, one of the major targets, again, under the vision for peace or under the supposed talk of peace, is changing the role of Masjid al-Aqsa.
As I had mentioned earlier, many concerns have been raised surrounding the phrasing of what exactly is going to happen to Masjid al-Aqsa in the deal made by Israel and the UAE. This just goes to show how important the use of language is. What implications will the ambiguous phrasing of this clause have in the future?
So you have the initial deal, and then you have the UAE deal, which says that people of Muslims from all over the world will be able to come in peace to pray at Masjid al-Aqsa. That is quite exciting. That people of all faiths should come to pray at Masjid al-Aqsa. But this is where the second part of that clause, becomes problematic, where it says that people of other faiths will be able to pray at the other sites in Jerusalem. Now, people who have dug into this are able to point out that what sounds very positive is in actual fact very dangerous, because from the international terminology used until this point in time, they always spoke of the Haram al-Sharif, using the Israeli terminology, they would say the Temple Mount. So when they use that terminology, the Haram al-Sharif / Temple Mount, as per the Israeli usage also, we're talking about the entire compound of Masjid al-Aqsa. And even from an Islamic understanding, Masjid al-Aqsa is not one structure or the other, and that's a big confusion that still persists until this point in time, where people say, the black dome structure is Masjid al-Aqsa, and the gold dome is the Dome of the Rock. That is an erroneous understanding, because as per classical Muslim understanding for years, for centuries basically, Masjid al-Aqsa is the entire compound, and all these structures are just parts of Masjid al-Aqsa instead of just being the entire Masjid al-Aqsa. So previously the documents always would speak about the Haram al-Sharif and this entire area being under Muslim sovereignty, the Jordanian Waqf looking after it. But when suddenly, you start talking of the Muslims will be allowed to pray at the Masjid al-Aqsa, that's a bit curious. You haven't used that terminology before. And we know when the Israelis use that terminology, they are actually talking about the black domed masjid, the Qibli masjid only. And therefore, even through the supposedly generous language, they're saying you can have that part of the compound and the rest of this is fair game for us or for whoever else, for us to establish sovereignty, for us to pray in it. So therefore, you're saying on the one hand, we hope to uphold the status quo, but on the other hand, this is a clear violation of the status quo. And it comes back to that point. Firstly, we often talk about the Palestinian struggle, but the implications of words are very dire and very serious, as can be seen in the subtleties that are used here. So it's important to understand the context of all these words and also to utilize them correctly.
You touched on it earlier, but what exactly are the explicit dangers posed by the Israel and UAE deal, as well as the deal of the century, to the sanctity of Masjid al-Aqsa?
Like you mentioned, it's that particular line. People in the United Arab Emirates, some who've applauded this deal, are very excited because one has to appreciate that while we can still, as South Africans, due to our diplomatic relations that exist, are able to visit Palestine quite freely, both what is the state of Israel as well as the occupied Palestinian territories. For most Arabs, it's something that they have long desired for, but because of the state of no relations, no normalization with Israel, they haven't been able to visit Palestine and obviously fulfill this great yearning of praying to Masjid al-Aqsa. So many of them, or a few of them, have been quite excited, particularly if not of anything else, that maybe this opens the door for us to pray to Masjid al-Aqsa. And here we are cautioning that this is not all that it seems. The Israeli NGO Terrestrial Jerusalem has been speaking about this as well, that this is kind of formalizing something that was a big taboo in international relations at this point of time, that this is a shared space and that this should be, that people of other faiths besides Muslims should be allowed to pray in Masjid al-Aqsa. So that's the biggest danger. And the other danger is very, very fast. The custodianship of Masjid al-Aqsa, which has for almost 100 years now been in the hands of the Islamic Waqf, which is run by the Jordanian government. No mention of them is made whatsoever in the text of this deal. So again, sidestepping the Palestinians, sidestepping the people of Jerusalem, sidestepping the Jordanians, who are an important player in all of this, and trying to establish legitimacy by going directly to the United Arab Emirates. So prayer, as I've argued in a piece, is something that we all yearn for, and people all yearn for Masjid al-Aqsa. At Masjid al-Aqsa, it's a sacred right, but it should come with dignity, and it should not become, a placing of normalizers in something, that supposedly establishes your right to pray, but at the same time depriving the Palestinians of their rights and effectively even changing the entire demography of Masjid al-Aqsa.
Now is most certainly the time for action from the Arab world, the Muslim world, and Palestinian solidarity networks at large. Of course, vigilance must be encouraged, but what do you believe to be the ideal response required going forward?
When we talk, Humairaa, about this concept of normalization, it is, in one sense, a colonization of the mind. That you reach a stage as the oppressed or even supporters of the oppressed to say that the oppressor is so strong, the oppressor, there's no chance of exacting justice from the oppressor, and therefore one just has to do away with one's demands and accept that the oppressor will always be militarily superior. The oppressor will always win, and therefore we just have to continue with business as usual. Therefore, we have to fight on an intellectual level the fact that the oppressor is a state that is morally strong. It might be militarily strong, but in terms of its moral right, its occupation stands on very, very shaky ground, and this is where we have to step in. Not only so sometimes when we have this discussion with say the Arab world, and let's fight against normalization in the Arab world, but normalization happens on a number of other lower levels and even affects people in our own country. Many people were surprised in the wake of the UAE deal, the kind of shocking tweets that came out of some Emiratis. We saw the shocking way that children were weaponized to support this deal. We saw children being forced or being made excited about this deal. Emirati children flying balloons and waving Israeli flags and singing Israeli songs, etc. And one wonders how did that happen? But even in our own country, there have been from various faith groups people taken on fully paid visits to the State of Israel, and this comes from social spheres, religious spheres, cultural spheres. Cultural exchange of individuals visiting South Africa and vice versa, and this vigilance should always be there. That despite the Palestinians being in a corner, the Palestinians have a moral right, and the moral right will always triumph over might, and we should not be sidetracked by any offers, sweeteners that come along the way under the name of dialogue, under the name of reconciliation, etc. And it should be justice that we are aspiring to. So that the vigilance is required in that sense. Also vigilance in the light of the previous point in terms of language, awareness in terms of that the occupation is ongoing. Perhaps occupation is talking about the usage of language. Occupation is a legal construct, but it's supposed to be something temporary. We need to perhaps use even stronger language to describe what's going on the ground. We need to not fall into the sense of complacency that annexation has not happened, when in actual fact it is a process, and it's continuing to happen. And sound off on a positive note, we also need not become despondent, because in all of this, the Palestinians remain steadfast. They're going nowhere. A quote here by the Palestinian political and religious leader Sheikh Raed Salah, who's also serving a jail sentence at the moment, saying that don't think because there's such a big focus on one country normalizing, and yes, others would probably also normalize. Appreciate that this is happening through arm bending. This is happening at an official level, and these states, or the leadership, unelected leadership in many cases of these states, do not represent the will of the people. And the will of the people predominantly, even in the Arab world, even in countries like Saudi Arabia and perhaps the United Arab Emirates, still leans towards justice for the Palestinians. So what Sheikh Raed Salah says, that people have appeared now who want to change the state of the Arab world through normalization, but in his characterization, these are vain attempts. He said that whoever allows himself to be cut off from the Palestinian, Arab, and Islamic constants will be boycotted by the people whose living conscience will remain the compass. It is true that the situation that we find ourselves in is quite painful to see this normalization, but again, as he says, in the life of the popular will, the popular will of the people will outlive that of the region, and the conscience of the Palestinian people and all those who support them will eventually triumph when it comes to Jerusalem, Masjid al-Aqsa, and the Palestinian cause. So that steadfastness in the wake of all of this, and understanding, not to fall into complacency, as well as a sense of resignation, because that is inevitably what fuels the path of normalization.
Jazakallah so much for joining us today, Hafiz Ibrahim, and thank you for shedding some light on the situation underway in the Middle East, one which will most certainly ricochet into the global arena.
Much appreciated. Jazakallah khairan.
That was Hafiz Ibrahim Musa, freelance journalist and a researcher at the Palestine Information Network, talking to us about the implications of the normalization of diplomatic ties between Israel and the UAE. And that brings us to the end of this afternoon's special broadcast. Remember that this segment can be found on both our Facebook and Twitter pages. From myself, Humairaa Mayet, and the entire team at Salam Media, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next week, Tuesday, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon.
ah